Margaret Chen's weathered hands froze on the kitchen windowsill, her evening tea cooling forgotten as three armed figures emerged from the Colorado darkness surrounding her isolated cabin. The largest man raised his rifle, its barrel gleaming under her porch light. These weren't ordinary burglars seeking easy prey from a 70-year-old widow. Behind her, four massive gray shadows rose from their resting places by the fireplace, their amber eyes reflecting the lamplight as low, rumbling growls filled the silence. Shadow, Storm, Luna, and Ghost, each weighing over 100 pounds, positioned themselves between Margaret and the approaching threat with the coordinated precision of a military unit. The lead intruder's confident smirk faltered as he processed what he was seeing through the window. This wasn't supposed to happen. The old woman wasn't supposed to have protection.
"Call this off, William," Margaret whispered into the darkness, recognizing something familiar in the man's haunted eyes despite never having met him before. How had 4 wolf cubs she'd rescued from a deadly blizzard 3 years ago become her only defense against men who'd come to destroy everything she loved? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Chen had never imagined that at 69 she would become the most controversial woman in Pinewood, Colorado. 3 years ago, she had been just another invisible widow living quietly in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor and a world away from the life she had once known. The cabin where she now faced down armed intruders had been her sanctuary since Robert's sudden heart attack 8 years earlier. Built by her late husband's own hands from local timber, it sat on 40 acres of pristine wilderness that had been in his family for 3 generations. Robert had always joked that if civilization ever collapsed, they would be perfectly fine up here with their vegetable garden, natural spring, and enough firewood to last a lifetime. What he hadn't prepared her for was the crushing loneliness that would follow his death, made infinitely worse by losing their daughter Emily to lupus just 2 years later. Emily had been 32, a brilliant artist whose paintings still hung throughout the cabin, frozen reminders of a future that would never unfold. The loss had nearly broken Margaret completely. Her son David, a successful surgeon in Denver, called religiously every Sunday, his voice tight with worry as he pleaded with her to sell the cabin and move into one of those nice senior communities near his practice. "Mom, you're completely isolated up there," he would say, the same conversation repeated week after week. "What if something happens? What if you fall? What if there's a medical emergency?" Margaret understood his concerns, but David had never grasped what this place meant to her. Every room held memories of the family they had built together. Robert's coffee mug still sitting by the kitchen sink, Emily's easel positioned to catch the morning light, the bedroom where she had nursed both of them through countless childhood illnesses and adult struggles. Before the wolves, her days had followed a predictable rhythm. She woke at dawn, tended her small vegetable garden, took long walks through the surrounding forest, and spent her evenings reading by the stone fireplace Robert had built with his own hands. Dr. Patricia Williams, the local veterinarian who had become her closest friend, stopped by monthly to check on her, and Tom Bradley, the postal worker, always lingered for coffee and conversation during his weekly mail delivery. Margaret had spent 37 years as a special education teacher before retiring, and her natural instinct to nurture and protect the vulnerable had never left her. Even in retirement, she volunteered at the county animal shelter when weather permitted, fostering abandoned dogs and cats until they could find permanent homes. She had an intuitive understanding of animals that her colleagues had always marveled at, an ability to calm the most traumatized rescue cases and earn the trust of creatures that had been failed by humans before. That gift, combined with her stubborn independence and fierce protective instincts, had set the stage for the confrontation now unfolding in her living room. Everything that made Margaret who she was had led to this moment when 4 wolves would determine whether she lived or died. The blizzard began exactly as the National Weather Service had predicted, with an eerie calm that fooled no one who had lived through Colorado winters. Margaret had spent December 15th preparing for what meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation storm, stocking her pantry with canned goods, filling every available container with water, and checking her backup generator twice. At 66, she had weathered dozens of mountain storms, but something about the approaching system felt different, more ominous. By evening, the wind had begun its low, haunting moan through the pine trees surrounding her cabin. Margaret settled into her favorite armchair beside the stone fireplace, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as she watched the first fat snowflakes dance past her kitchen window. The weather radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates, wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, and snowfall accumulations that could reach 4 feet by morning. She had just decided to head to bed early when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of wind and creaking timber, a scratching, desperate and rhythmic, coming from her front door. Margaret paused, teacup halfway to her lips, straining to listen above the storm's growing fury. There it was again, accompanied by what sounded almost like crying. Her first thought was that a tree branch had broken loose and was scraping against the door, but as she approached the entrance, the sounds became unmistakably organic. Something alive was on her porch, and it was in distress. Margaret peered through the peephole but could see nothing except swirling snow illuminated by her porch light. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay safely inside, Margaret cracked open the door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from her grasp, and snow pelted her face with stinging intensity. But there, huddled against the wooden planks of her porch, were 4 small, dark shapes barely visible against the accumulating white. Puppies. 4 tiny puppies, their fur matted with ice and snow, shivering so violently that Margaret could see the tremors even in the dim light. The smallest one, a female with distinctive white markings around her eyes, wasn't moving at all. "Oh, dear God," Margaret whispered, her voice lost in the wind. Without hesitation, she stepped onto the porch, the cold hitting her like a physical blow even through her heavy robe and slippers. The largest puppy, a dark male, lifted his head weakly as she approached, his eyes reflecting the porch light with an intelligence that seemed too mature for such a young animal. Margaret scooped up 2 of the puppies, surprised by how light they felt despite their apparent age. Their bodies were ice cold, their breathing shallow and rapid. Racing back inside, she deposited them on a thick blanket near the fireplace before returning for the other 2. The wind had grown even stronger in those few seconds, and she had to grip the door frame to keep from being knocked over. The smallest puppy, the one with white facial markings, felt limp in her arms. Margaret's heart clenched as she carried the motionless form inside, followed by the 4th and final member of the tiny pack. As she bolted the door against the storm, she could hear the wind reaching a terrifying crescendo outside, rattling windows and making the entire cabin shudder. In the warm glow of her living room, Margaret got her first clear look at what she had rescued. These weren't ordinary puppies. Their ears were too pointed, their snouts too elongated, their paws too large for their bodies. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She had just brought 4 wolf cubs into her home. For a moment, Margaret simply stared at the cubs, her mind racing through the implications. Keeping wolves, even orphaned cubs, was illegal in Colorado. If discovered, she could face serious fines and criminal charges. The cubs would be confiscated and most likely euthanized, as wildlife authorities had no rehabilitation facilities equipped to handle wolves. But as she watched the smallest cub's chest barely rising and falling, all legal considerations vanished. These babies were dying, and she was their only hope. Margaret sprang into action with the efficiency of someone who had raised 2 children and countless foster animals. She wrapped each cub in warm towels,
then used her hairdryer on the lowest heat setting to gradually warm their frozen bodies. The largest cub, whom she mentally dubbed Shadow for his dark coloring, responded first, lifting his head and attempting to crawl closer to the heat source. Next came the preparation of emergency formula. Margaret mixed warm milk with a small amount of honey and corn syrup, then used an old medicine dropper to carefully feed each cub. Shadow and the two medium-sized cubs, one with gray patches she named Storm, and the lightest colored one she called Ghost, managed to swallow small amounts, but the smallest female, Luna, remained frighteningly unresponsive. For the next 6 hours, Margaret barely left the cub's side. She took turns holding Luna against her chest, using her own body heat to warm the tiny creature while continuing to offer drops of formula every few minutes. She monitored each cub's breathing, adjusted their blankets, and kept the fire burning steadily to maintain a warm temperature in the room. Around 3 in the morning, Luna finally stirred. The little female's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Margaret's face with an intensity that took the older woman's breath away. There was something almost human in that gaze, a depth of understanding that seemed impossible in such a young animal. "That's it, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, offering the dropper of formula. This time, Luna latched onto it eagerly, drinking with desperate hunger that spoke to how close she had come to death. By dawn, all 4 cubs were active and alert, though still clearly weak from their ordeal. Margaret had fashioned a makeshift den from cardboard boxes lined with her softest blankets, positioning it close enough to the fireplace to maintain warmth but far enough away to ensure safety. The cubs huddled together in a furry pile, occasionally mewing softly in what sounded almost like conversation. As the storm raged outside for 2 more days, Margaret found herself falling completely under the cubs' spell. They were remarkably intelligent, quickly learning to come when she called and following her around the cabin like a small fusery parade. Shadow appointed himself the leader, always positioning himself between Margaret and any potential threat, even something as benign as the coffee grinder. Storm showed an early fascination with hunting, pouncing on dust motes and shadows with fierce concentration. Ghost proved to be the most cautious, studying every new situation carefully before acting. And Luna, sweet Luna, seemed to understand Margaret's moods with uncanny accuracy, cuddling close when the older woman felt sad, and playing energetically when she needed cheering up. When Dr. Patricia Williams finally managed to reach the cabin after the roads were cleared, her reaction was everything Margaret had feared. "Margaret, do you realize what you've done?" Patricia asked, staring at the 4 cubs who were wrestling playfully on the living room rug. "These are wolves. Actual wolves." "I know what they are," Margaret replied calmly, watching Luna gnaw contentedly on a rope toy. "But they would have died out there. I couldn't just let that happen." Patricia sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her friend's jaw. "The law requires me to report this to wildlife authorities. These cubs need to be in a proper facility." "What proper facility?" Margaret challenged. "The nearest wolf sanctuary is 800 miles away, and they're full. You know as well as I do that these babies would be euthanized." The 2 women stared at each other across the living room while the cubs continued their play, blissfully unaware that their futures hung in the balance. Finally, Patricia shook her head and closed her medical bag. "I didn't see anything," she said quietly. "But Margaret, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into." 6 months had transformed Margaret's life in ways she never could have imagined. The 4 wolf cubs had grown from helpless infants weighing barely 3 pounds each into magnificent adolescents approaching 40 pounds, their true nature becoming impossible to hide. Shadow had developed into a striking animal with coal-black fur and piercing amber eyes that seemed to assess every situation with calculated intelligence. Storm's gray-patched coat rippled with developing muscle as he practiced hunting techniques on Margaret's houseplants and furniture. Ghost moved like a pale specter through the cabin, his light coloring making him nearly invisible against the snow that still capped the mountain peaks. And Luna, beautiful Luna with her distinctive white facial markings, had become Margaret's constant companion, following her from room to room with devoted attention. The wolves' intelligence astounded Margaret daily. They had learned to open doors by working together, with one jumping up to turn the handle while another pushed. They understood complex commands and seemed to read her emotions with uncanny accuracy. When she felt sad thinking about Emily or Robert, they would gather around her, offering silent comfort. When she worked in her garden, they formed a protective perimeter, alert for any potential threats. Most remarkably, they had never shown even a hint of aggression toward her, treating Margaret with the reverence typically reserved for an alpha in their pack hierarchy. But their growth brought new challenges that Margaret couldn't ignore. Tom Bradley, her postal worker, had been the first person outside of Dr. Williams to discover her secret. On a warm June morning, he had arrived for his weekly mail delivery to find 4 wolves lounging on Margaret's front porch like oversized dogs. His terrified shout had brought Margaret running from her vegetable garden, her heart pounding as she saw Tom backed against his mail truck, his face pale with shock. "Tom, it's okay," Margaret had called out, moving slowly toward the wolves who had risen at the sound of distress but remained calm. "They won't hurt you. They're completely gentle." "Margaret, those are wolves!" Tom had stammered, his hand reaching for the radio on his belt. "I have to call this in. There are protocols." "Please," Margaret had interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to manage unruly classrooms. "Give me 5 minutes. Let me show you who they really are." What followed was perhaps the most important 5 minutes of Margaret's life. She called each wolf by name, demonstrating their obedience and gentle nature. Luna approached Tom slowly, her head lowered submissively, and gently nuzzled his outstretched hand. Shadow sat on command, his massive frame radiating calm strength rather than threat. Storm and Ghost performed simple tricks Margaret had taught them, their playful behavior more reminiscent of large dogs than dangerous predators. By the end of those 5 minutes, Tom was scratching behind Luna's ears and marveling at their intelligence. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, his initial fear replaced by wonder. "They're like something out of a fairy tale." Tom's acceptance proved crucial when word of the wolves inevitably spread through the small mountain community. His testimony that the wolves were gentle and well-trained carried weight with neighbors who trusted his judgment. But not everyone was convinced, and Margaret soon found herself at the center of a growing controversy that threatened to tear the community apart. Dr. Patricia Williams visited more frequently now, her professional concern evident as she monitored the wolves' development. "Margaret, they're getting too big," she warned during one of her examinations. "Shadow is already 80 pounds, and he's not even fully grown. What happens when they're full-sized adults weighing over 100 pounds each?" The question haunted Margaret because she didn't have a good answer. She had researched wolf behavior extensively, reading everything she could find about human-wolf relationships and domestication attempts. The scientific literature was not encouraging. Wolves, even hand-raised ones, typically became increasingly unpredictable as they matured, their wild instincts asserting themselves despite human socialization. Her research led her to Dr. James Morrison, a renowned wolf expert from the University of Wyoming who specialized in wolf-human interactions. When she contacted him, expecting dismissal or lecture about the dangers of keeping wolves, his response surprised her. "I'd like to see these animals myself," he had said. "What you're describing challenges everything we think we know about wolf behavior." Dr. Morrison's visit in late July became a turning point. A distinguished man in his 60s with graying hair and kind eyes, he spent an entire day observing the wolves' interactions with Margaret and each other.
His scientific training warred with what he witnessed, wolves who responded to human commands with dog-like obedience, who showed no territorial aggression toward strangers, who demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded anything documented in wild wolf populations. In 30 years of studying wolves, I've never observed anything comparable, Dr. Morrison told Margaret as they sat on her porch, watching the wolves play in the meadow beyond her garden. These animals have formed a pack structure with you as the undisputed alpha. It's unprecedented. Does that mean I can keep them? Margaret asked, hope evident in her voice. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Legally, no. Ethically, I'm not sure anyone has the right to break up what you've created here, but practically speaking, you're facing challenges that will only grow more difficult. Those challenges materialized sooner than expected. An anonymous complaint to the Colorado Division of Wildlife triggered an official investigation. Deputy Sheriff Jessica Torres, a young woman who had grown up in the area, arrived at Margaret's cabin on a sweltering August morning with the unenviable task of serving Margaret with a notice of wildlife violation. Mrs. Chen, I have to inform you that harboring wild wolves without proper permits is a federal offense, Jessica said, her official tone softening as she watched Luna approach curiously. The Division of Wildlife has received complaints about dangerous animals on your property. Margaret's heart sank, but she wasn't prepared to surrender without a fight. What exactly are my options, Deputy Torres? Jessica glanced around nervously as Shadow emerged from the forest, carrying a stick he'd been playing with. Despite his imposing size, the wolf's body language was completely relaxed, more interested in his game than the stranger on his territory. You could apply for a wildlife rehabilitation permit, Jessica said slowly, but that would require converting your property into a licensed facility with specific enclosures, insurance, educational components. Then that's what I'll do, Margaret declared, her voice firm with resolution. The permit application process proved to be a bureaucratic nightmare. Margaret needed to demonstrate that her facility met strict safety requirements, that she had adequate veterinary support, that her wolves served an educational purpose, and that she possessed the financial resources to maintain a proper sanctuary. The costs were staggering: reinforced enclosures, liability insurance, educational materials, and regular inspections would require tens of thousands of dollars she didn't have. David's reaction when she called to explain the situation was predictably explosive. "Mom, this is insane," he shouted over the phone. "You're risking everything for a pack of wolves. What if they hurt someone? What if they turn on you? You could lose the house, you could go to jail, you could be killed." "They're family, David," Margaret replied simply. "Would you abandon your children because caring for them became difficult?" The comparison stung because David knew his mother's capacity for unconditional love. He had seen her care for his sister Emily through years of illness, never once complaining about the burden or suggesting they consider other options. If Margaret saw these wolves as her children, she would fight for them with the same fierce devotion. Understanding his mother's determination, David hired an environmental attorney and began the expensive process of helping Margaret navigate the permit requirements. The legal fees alone consumed most of Margaret's modest savings, but she pressed forward with single-minded determination. Meanwhile, the controversy in Pinewood intensified. Frank Morrison, a new resident who had moved to the area specifically for its safety and tranquility, organized a petition demanding the wolves' immediate removal. "This woman is putting our entire community at risk," he declared at a heated town hall meeting. "What happens when those predators decide they want something other than the old lady's companionship? What happens when they encounter our children?" Margaret attended that meeting with her head held high, flanked by supporters including Tom Bradley, Dr. Williams, and several other longtime residents who had come to know the wolves personally. "These animals have never shown aggression toward anyone," she stated calmly when given the opportunity to speak. "They are intelligent, gentle creatures who ask only for acceptance and understanding." The room erupted in arguments that split along predictable lines. Longtime residents who trusted Margaret's judgment versus newcomers who saw only the potential for disaster. As Margaret listened to the heated exchanges, she realized that her decision to save 4 dying wolf cubs had forced her community to confront fundamental questions about coexistence, tolerance, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. That night, as she sat on her porch with the 4 wolves arranged protectively around her, Margaret made a solemn promise. "Whatever happens," she told them, stroking Luna's fur as the young wolf rested her head on Margaret's lap, "we'll face it together. Families don't abandon each other, no matter how difficult things become." The following 18 months tested Margaret's resolve in ways she had never anticipated. The wolves' transformation from playful adolescents into magnificent adults brought both wonder and increasing challenges that seemed to multiply with each passing week. Shadow had grown into a formidable alpha male, weighing nearly 120 pounds, his intelligence and protective instincts making him both Margaret's guardian and the source of growing community concern. Storm had developed into a natural hunter, whose instincts led him to patrol the property boundaries and bring Margaret gifts of rabbits and birds, which he would lay proudly at her feet, like offerings from a devoted son. Ghost had become the pack's sentinel, his pale form moving like a specter through the forest as he monitored every approach to their territory with silent vigilance. And Luna, precious Luna, had evolved into Margaret's emotional support system, seeming to sense her moods and needs with an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. The wolves' remarkable intelligence continued to astound everyone who observed them. Dr. Morrison made monthly visits to document their behavior, filling notebook after notebook with observations that challenged conventional wisdom about wolf cognition and pack dynamics. The wolves had learned to distinguish between different types of visitors, greeting familiar faces like Tom Bradley and Dr. Williams with relaxed friendliness while maintaining cautious alertness around strangers. They responded to complex verbal commands and seemed to understand Margaret's routine so well that they anticipated her needs before she expressed them. Most remarkably, they had developed their own communication system with Margaret that went far beyond typical animal training. A specific whine from Luna meant she wanted to go outside. Shadow's low rumble indicated he sensed something unusual in the forest. Storm's excited yipping signaled he had found something interesting during his patrols. Ghost's silent appearance at Margaret's side meant potential danger was approaching. This sophisticated communication network made Margaret feel safer than she had since Robert's death, surrounded by 4 devoted guardians who were always alert to her well-being. But their growing size and obvious wolf characteristics made concealment increasingly impossible. Margaret's property had become the subject of constant scrutiny from wildlife officers, curious neighbors, and journalists drawn by rumors of the wolf lady living in the Colorado mountains. The permit application process had become a bureaucratic labyrinth that consumed Margaret's time, energy, and rapidly dwindling financial resources. The educational component required for her wildlife sanctuary license forced Margaret to open her property to supervised visits from local schools and conservation groups. These visits proved to be double-edged experiences that highlighted both the wolves' gentle nature and the deep-seated fears many people harbored about apex predators. Children who arrived terrified would leave fascinated after watching Luna perform tricks or observing Shadow's calm intelligence during feeding demonstrations, but parents often remained skeptical, their protective instincts triggered by proximity to animals they viewed as inherently dangerous. Margaret's relationship with her son David had grown increasingly strained as the legal and financial pressures mounted. During his monthly visits, she could see the worry etched in his features as he surveyed the reinforced enclosures he was helping to fund, the insurance documents that arrived weekly, and the growing pile of legal paperwork that seemed to regenerate faster than it could be processed. "Mom, you're sacrificing everything for these animals," he would say, his voice tight with frustration. "Your savings are gone. You're under constant legal scrutiny, and the stress is aging you." Margaret understood his concerns because they weren't entirely unfounded. The financial burden was overwhelming, and the constant pressure from wildlife authorities, hostile neighbors, and media attention had taken a toll on her health. She had lost weight, developed persistent headaches, and found herself lying awake at night worrying about scenarios where the wolves might be confiscated or destroyed. But whenever she considered surrender, she would look into Luna's trusting eyes or feel Shadow's protective presence beside her, and her resolve would strengthen. The community division over the wolves had created lasting rifts in Pinewood's social fabric. Margaret's supporters, led by Tom Bradley and Dr. Williams, organized fundraising events to help cover the sanctuary's operational costs. They sold homemade crafts at farmers markets, organized benefit dinners, and created an informal network of volunteers who helped with property maintenance and educational programs. These efforts touched Margaret deeply, proving that despite the controversy, many people believed in what she was trying to accomplish. However, the opposition had also organized, led by Frank Morrison, whose fear of the wolves had evolved into obsessive determination to see them removed. Frank had enlisted the support of several other recent transplants to the area, people who had moved to rural Colorado seeking safety and tranquility but found themselves living near what they considered a ticking time bomb. They filed formal complaints with every relevant agency, organized petition drives, and lobbied the county commissioners to pass ordinances that would make wolf ownership impossible. The media attention brought both support and additional scrutiny. National wildlife organizations praised Margaret's work as groundbreaking research into human-wolf relationships, while others condemned it as dangerous anthropomorphization of wild predators. Television crews arrived regularly, their cameras capturing the wolves' remarkable behavior, while journalists struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. Was Margaret a visionary conservationist or a reckless individual putting her community at risk? Dr. Morrison's research had begun attracting international attention from animal behaviorists and conservationists, fascinated by the unprecedented relationship Margaret had developed with her wolves. "What you've achieved here challenges fundamental assumptions about domestication and interspecies bonding," he told her during one of his visits. "These wolves display behavioral adaptations that suggest remarkable cognitive flexibility." The scientific interest provided some validation for Margaret's efforts, but it also brought additional pressure. Researchers from universities across the country requested permission to study the wolves, each adding their own requirements and complications to an already overwhelming situation. Margaret found herself torn between wanting to share the wolves' remarkable story and protecting them from becoming mere research subjects. As winter approached, bringing with it the third anniversary of the blizzard that had brought the wolves into her life, Margaret faced a crisis that threatened everything she had worked to build. The final permit inspection was scheduled for early December, and failure to meet the stringent requirements would result in immediate confiscation of the wolves. Despite 18 months of preparation and enormous financial investment, several critical issues remained unresolved. The liability insurance requirements had proven particularly challenging. Most companies refused to provide coverage for wolf ownership, and those willing to write policies demanded premiums that exceeded Margaret's annual income.
The educational facility requirements necessitated construction of a visitor center with proper restrooms, parking, and safety features that would cost more than Margaret's cabin was worth. Most troubling, the inspection team would include a federal wildlife specialist whose reputation for strict enforcement made approval unlikely. Margaret's anxiety was affecting the wolves, who sensed her distress and responded with increased protectiveness that ironically made them appear more threatening to outsiders. Shadow had begun positioning himself between Margaret and all visitors, his imposing presence intimidating even longtime supporters. Storm's territorial patrols had expanded beyond the property boundaries, leading to complaints from neighbors who found wolf tracks on their land. Ghost's surveillance activities had intensified to the point where he rarely left his observation posts. Luna had become increasingly clingy, rarely allowing Margaret out of her sight and whimpering softly whenever they were separated. The strain was taking its toll on Margaret's health in ways that couldn't be ignored. Doctor Williams had begun insisting on regular checkups, concerned about Margaret's elevated blood pressure, persistent fatigue, and obvious weight loss. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Patricia warned during one examination. "Your body is telling you to slow down." But slowing down felt impossible when every day brought new challenges that demanded immediate attention. Legal documents required review and response. Volunteer schedules needed coordination. Educational programs had to be planned and supervised. Property maintenance demanded constant vigilance. The wolves' care required hours of daily attention. And through it all, Margaret maintained her determination to prove that peaceful coexistence between humans and wolves was not only possible but beneficial for both species. As December arrived with its harsh winds and early snows, Margaret stood at the same kitchen window where she had first spotted the dying wolf cubs 3 years earlier. The wolves had gathered on the porch, their thick winter coats making them appear even larger and more imposing than usual. They seemed to sense that change was coming, their behavior more alert and protective than she had ever observed. Margaret placed her hand against the cold glass, watching her 4 companions and wondering if she had the strength to protect them from the forces gathering against their unlikely family. In less than 2 weeks, officials would arrive to determine their fate, and Margaret feared that all her sacrifices might prove insufficient to keep them together. The months leading to that fateful night began with what seemed like a victory. Margaret's permit application had finally been approved after nearly 2 years of bureaucratic battles, transforming her property into the official Emily Chen Memorial Wolf Sanctuary. The celebratory ribbon-cutting ceremony in early autumn had drawn supporters from across Colorado, including wildlife researchers, conservationists, and families whose children had participated in the sanctuary's educational programs. Margaret stood before the gathered crowd that October afternoon, wearing her best navy dress and the pearl necklace Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. Shadow, Storm, Luna, and Ghost sat beside her in perfect formation, their magnificent coats gleaming in the crisp mountain air as cameras captured what seemed like the culmination of an impossible dream. Dr. Morrison presented the official certification while David beamed with pride from the front row, his earlier opposition completely transformed into wholehearted support. The sanctuary's success had brought international attention to Margaret's work. Universities were sending researchers to study the unprecedented human-wolf relationships she had developed. Television documentaries highlighted her story as a triumph of compassion over fear. Children's letters arrived daily, thanking her for showing them that wolves weren't the monsters from fairy tales, but intelligent, loyal creatures deserving of protection and respect. But success also brought unwanted scrutiny. Among the news coverage and research articles, Margaret's story had reached someone whose interest was far from academic. William Crawford had been following reports about the Wolf Lady of Colorado for months, his obsession growing with each article that praised Margaret's relationship with the animals he viewed as murderers. William's fixation had intensified after reading Dr. Morrison's research papers documenting the wolves' remarkable intelligence and emotional sophistication. To William's trauma-warped perspective, these weren't scientific achievements but dangerous propaganda that humanized killers. Every article describing the wolves' gentle nature, every photograph showing children safely interacting with them, every testimonial from visitors who had overcome their fears felt like a personal betrayal of his son's memory. The breaking point came when William saw a television interview where Margaret spoke about the healing power of interspecies relationships. "These wolves saved me from despair," she had said, Luna resting peacefully beside her chair. "They taught me that love doesn't recognize species boundaries, that family can be found in the most unexpected places." Those words triggered something violent in William's psyche. In his mind, Margaret wasn't just naive. She was actively endangering others by promoting dangerous myths about wolf nature. He began making the 3-hour drive from his isolated cabin to surveillance points around Margaret's property, watching through binoculars as she went about her daily routines with 4 creatures he believed would eventually turn on her. Margaret remained unaware of the threat studying her from the forest, but the wolves had begun sensing something wrong. Their behavior had grown increasingly protective over the past few weeks, with Shadow rarely leaving her side and Ghost extending his patrol routes far beyond their usual boundaries. Luna had become almost clingy, whimpering softly whenever Margaret moved out of sight, while Storm brought her more gifts than usual, as if trying to prove his value to the pack. Dr. Patricia Williams noticed the change during her monthly veterinary visits. "They seem more alert than usual," she observed, watching Shadow position himself between her and Margaret despite 3 years of friendship. "Has anything unusual happened recently?" Margaret had dismissed Patricia's concerns, attributing the wolves' behavior to the increased visitor traffic since the sanctuary's official opening. But deep down, she felt it too. A tension in the air that reminded her of the hours before violent storms, when animals sensed approaching danger long before humans recognized the threat. The sanctuary's educational programs continued despite the wolves' heightened alertness. School groups still arrived weekly for guided tours, and Margaret took pride in watching fearful children gradually warm to Luna's gentle presence. But she began limiting the number of visitors per session and scheduling them earlier in the day, responding to an instinct she couldn't quite identify. William's surveillance had revealed Margaret's routines with military precision. He knew she walked the property boundaries each morning with all 4 wolves, that Dr. Williams visited monthly on Thursdays, that David came from Denver every other weekend. Most importantly, he had identified the times when Margaret was most vulnerable, evening hours when she was alone in the cabin with only the wolves for protection. The plan William constructed fed on his military background and his consuming need to prove that Margaret's trust in the wolves was misplaced. He recruited 2 desperate men from a Denver halfway house, Jake Morrison and Bobby Chen, both struggling with addiction and legal troubles, both willing to participate in what William described as a simple robbery that would expose the wolves' true nature. William's twisted logic convinced him that when threatened, the wolves would revert to their killer instincts, attacking not just the intruders, but possibly Margaret herself. The incident would vindicate his beliefs about wolf nature, while teaching Margaret the hard lesson he believed she needed to learn about the consequences of anthropomorphizing dangerous predators. As December approached, bringing with it the anniversary of the blizzard rescue that had started everything, Margaret felt an increasing sense of unease she couldn't shake. The wolves' protective behavior had intensified to the point where they formed a constant barrier between her and any visitors. Shadow had begun growling at sounds only he could hear,
while Ghost's surveillance activities had become so vigilant that he rarely rested during daylight hours. Margaret found herself checking locks more frequently and keeping Robert's old hunting rifle closer at hand, though she couldn't have explained what threat she was preparing for. The sanctuary's success should have brought her complete satisfaction, but instead she felt like prey being stalked by a predator she couldn't see. On the night of December 15th, exactly 3 years after she had rescued 4 dying wolf cubs from a blizzard, Margaret sat by her fireplace reading to the wolves as she did every evening. Shadow lay at her feet, his massive head resting on her slippers. Storm and Ghost flanked her chair like sentries, while Luna curled up beside her, the thin scar on her shoulder visible beneath her thick winter coat. The wind outside had begun its familiar mountain song, but tonight it carried undertones that made all 4 wolves lift their heads in unison. Their amber eyes reflected the firelight as they focused on sounds Margaret couldn't hear, their bodies tensing with anticipation of danger that was already moving through the darkness toward their sanctuary. Margaret closed her book and looked at her 4 companions, noting their alertness with growing concern. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. But the wolves' only response was to move closer to her chair, forming a protective circle that would soon be put to the ultimate test. In the forest surrounding the cabin, 3 figures moved through the darkness with deadly intent, unaware that the very animals they planned to provoke had already detected their approach and were preparing to defend their family with the intelligence, loyalty, and fierce love that Margaret had nurtured for 3 transformative years. The gunshot shattered the mountain silence like a thunderclap, its echo reverberating through the cabin and into Margaret's very soul. Time seemed to fragment into horrifying slow-motion frames as she watched Luna collapse to the hardwood floor, crimson spreading beneath her beautiful white-marked face. The wolf who had been her constant companion, her emotional anchor through 3 years of controversy and struggle, lay motionless while chaos erupted around them. Shadow's roar of rage was unlike anything Margaret had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, primal and terrifying in its fury. The massive alpha wolf launched himself at Jake Morrison, the panicked gunman who had fired in terror when cornered by the pack. Storm and Ghost flanked their fallen pack-mate, their hackles raised and teeth bared as they faced the 3 intruders who had brought violence into their sanctuary. Margaret's scream cut through the mayhem, a sound of pure anguish that spoke to every mother's worst nightmare. She threw herself down beside Luna, her hands hovering over the wounded wolf's still form, afraid to touch and cause more damage, but desperate to offer comfort. Blood was pooling beneath Luna's shoulder, and Margaret could see the terrible wound where the bullet had torn through fur and flesh. "Look what you've done," Margaret cried, her voice breaking as she finally pressed her hands against Luna's wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "She was protecting me. She was protecting all of us." William Crawford stood frozen in Margaret's living room, the carefully constructed justifications for his actions crumbling as he watched the elderly woman cradle the injured wolf. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. In his mind, the wolves were supposed to be aggressive monsters who would attack without provocation, validating his belief that they were dangerous killers who needed to be eliminated. Instead, he was witnessing the aftermath of an unprovoked assault on animals who had been defending their family. Jake and Bobby, the 2 desperate men William had recruited with promises of easy money, were backing toward the door as Shadow advanced on them with deadly intent. Jake still held the smoking rifle, his hands shaking so violently he could barely maintain his grip. "They're gonna kill us," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Jesus Christ, they're gonna tear us apart." "Nobody moves," William commanded, his own weapon raised, though his voice lacked conviction. The scene before him was too much like another memory, Another time, when innocent blood had been spilled and lives destroyed by violence, his son Tommy's death had been quick, merciful in its swiftness. This was something far worse, watching a creature suffer while the person who loved her most begged for help that wouldn't come. Margaret looked up at William through her tears, and he saw something in her eyes that cut him deeper than any accusation could have. It wasn't hatred or anger, it was profound disappointment, the look of someone who had recognized his pain and offered understanding, only to have that compassion repaid with cruelty. "Your son wouldn't want this," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above Luna's labored breathing. "No child would want their parent to cause this kind of suffering." The words hit William like physical blows because he knew they were true. Tommy had loved animals with the pure, uncomplicated affection of childhood. He had rescued baby birds, cried over roadkill, and begged William to take in every stray dog they encountered. The boy would be horrified to see what his father had become in the name of avenging his death. "Doctor." Patricia Williams's voice suddenly crackled through Margaret's emergency radio, responding to the 911 call Margaret had managed to make during the initial confrontation. "Margaret, this is Patricia. I'm 5 minutes out with the sheriff's department. Hold on, honey. Just hold on." The promise of help seemed to break something inside William. He looked around Margaret's living room, at the family photos showing a woman who had lost her husband and daughter, at the educational materials spread across the coffee table, at the 4 dog beds arranged near the fireplace where the wolves slept each night. This wasn't the lair of someone enabling dangerous predators. This was the home of someone who had built an unlikely family and was now watching it be destroyed. Luna stirred slightly, her amber eyes fluttering open to focus on Margaret's face. The connection between them was palpable, a bond that transcended species and spoke to something fundamental about love and loyalty. Luna tried to lift her head, as if wanting to comfort Margaret despite her own injuries, and Margaret gently stroked the wolf's fur while whispering words of reassurance. "I'm here, baby girl," Margaret murmured, her tears falling onto Luna's coat. "I'm not going anywhere. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay." Shadow had moved closer to the intruders, his massive frame radiating controlled menace as he positioned himself between them and his wounded packmate. But there was something almost human in his amber eyes as he glanced back at Luna. Grief, rage, and protective love combined in an expression that challenged everything William believed about these animals being mindless killers. Storm and Ghost maintained their flanking positions, but their attention was divided between the threat posed by the intruders and concern for their fallen family member. Their pack dynamics were on full display, coordinated, intelligent, and motivated by loyalty rather than bloodlust. These weren't the savage beasts of William's nightmares. They were a family defending their own. The sound of approaching sirens began to penetrate the cabin's tense atmosphere, growing steadily louder as help finally neared. But Margaret wasn't sure help would arrive in time. Luna's breathing was becoming more labored, and the amount of blood on the floor was terrifying. Margaret had seen enough injuries during her years of fostering animals to recognize when an animal was in critical condition. "She's dying because of you," Margaret said to William, her voice gaining strength as her grief transformed into righteous anger. "Luna never hurt anyone. She's never shown aggression toward a single person. She's gentle and intelligent and loving, and you shot her because of your own trauma." Jake and Bobby had reached the door, their nerve finally breaking completely. "We're done with this," Jake declared, dropping the rifle and bolting outside into the night. Bobby followed without a word, leaving William alone to face the consequences of the violence he had orchestrated. William looked down at his own weapon, seeing it as if for the first time. When had he become the kind of person who would recruit criminals to help him attack an elderly woman and her pets? When had his grief transformed him into someone Tommy wouldn't recognize? The gun felt impossibly heavy in his hands, weighted down by the realization of what he had done. The sirens were very close now, and William could see flashing lights beginning to illuminate the trees around Margaret's cabin. In moments, law enforcement would arrive to find him standing over a wounded animal and a traumatized elderly woman holding a weapon that made his guilt obvious. His military training told him to run, to escape while he still could, but his conscience kept him frozen in place. Margaret continued to cradle Luna, her voice soft and soothing as she spoke to the injured wolf. "Remember when you were just a tiny baby, so cold and scared? I warmed you up and fed you and you got strong and beautiful. You're going to get strong again. Dr. Williams is coming and she's going to fix you right up." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Margaret could feel Luna's strength ebbing. The wolf's breathing was becoming more shallow, her eyes struggling to maintain focus. 3 years of love and devotion, 3 years of building an impossible bond across species lines might end here on her living room floor because one man couldn't overcome his own pain. The cabin door burst open as sheriff's deputies flooded in, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. But the scene that greeted them defied their expectations. Instead of a dangerous animal attack, they found an elderly woman cradling a wounded wolf, while 3 other wolves maintained protective positions without showing aggression toward the arriving officers. "Drop your weapon," Deputy Torres commanded, her service pistol trained on William, who still held his rifle. "Drop it now!" William slowly lowered his gun to the floor, his hands raised in surrender. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he looked one last time at Margaret and Luna, understanding finally that he had destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable in the name of a vengeance that could never heal his own wounds. Dr. Williams rushed past the arresting officers, her veterinary bag in hand, as she dropped to her knees beside Margaret and Luna. Her professional assessment was swift and grim. Luna had lost significant blood and was going into shock. Without immediate surgery, the wolf Margaret had rescued from a blizzard 3 years ago would die from a wound inflicted by human hatred and fear. The 48 hours following Luna's shooting became a crucible that would either destroy everything Margaret had built or transform it into something even more powerful. As Dr. Patricia Williams worked frantically to stabilize Luna's condition in her makeshift operating room in Margaret's barn, the outside world erupted in a media frenzy that threatened to overshadow the life-and-death struggle taking place behind closed doors. William Crawford's confession to the police had sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. His detailed admission of planning the attack, recruiting accomplices, and deliberately provoking a confrontation shattered the narrative that anti-wolf activists had been promoting for months. Instead of validating fears about dangerous predators, the incident had exposed the dangerous extremism that such fears could breed in troubled minds. "I wanted them to attack," William told Detective Sarah Martinez during his recorded interrogation, his voice hollow with the weight of his realization. "I thought if people saw their true nature, they would understand why these animals needed to be eliminated. But watching that wolf get shot, seeing how the old woman held her," his voice broke completely. "My son Tommy would have been horrified by what I became." The confession played on news channels across the country, creating an unprecedented shift in public perception. Animal rights organizations that had initially criticized Margaret for keeping wolves now rallied to her defense. Wildlife experts appeared on television programs to explain the remarkable intelligence and loyalty the wolves had demonstrated in protecting their human family without showing unprovoked aggression toward the intruders. But Margaret barely noticed the media attention swirling around her property. Her entire world had narrowed to the barn where Luna fought for her life, supported by the other 3 wolves who had not left their pack members' side since the shooting.
Shadow lay pressed against the makeshift recovery pen, his massive head resting close to Luna's still form. Storm and Ghost maintained constant vigil from opposite sides, creating a protective barrier that Dr. Williams had to navigate carefully during her medical interventions. The bullet damaged significant muscle tissue and nicked a bone, Patricia explained to Margaret during one of her brief updates. But wolves are incredibly resilient. If we can prevent infection and keep her stable through the next 24 hours, she has a good chance of recovery. Margaret had not slept since the shooting, maintaining her own vigil beside Luna while dealing with the constant stream of visitors, reporters, and officials who demanded her attention. David had driven up from Denver immediately upon hearing the news, his medical training allowing him to assist Dr. Williams while his emotional support helped Margaret stay strong during the crisis. The legal aftermath moved swiftly. William faced multiple felony charges, including breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and animal cruelty. Jake Morrison and Bobby Chen, the accomplices who had fled the scene, were captured within hours and provided full confessions in exchange for reduced sentences. But the most significant development came when the district attorney announced that all charges against Margaret for her sanctuary operations had been permanently dropped. Mrs. Chen's wolves demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligent, protective behavior that validates her educational mission, District Attorney Robert Chen told reporters. This incident proves that when properly socialized, these animals pose no threat to public safety and in fact serve as remarkable ambassadors for wildlife conservation. The legal vindication felt hollow to Margaret as she watched Luna struggle through fever and pain during her recovery. The thin scar that would forever mark the wolf's shoulder served as a permanent reminder of how human hatred and fear could destroy the innocent. Margaret blamed herself for not recognizing the threat sooner, for allowing her sanctuary's success to make her complacent about the dangers that still lurked in minds twisted by trauma and prejudice. On the second night after the shooting, as Margaret dozed fitfully in a chair beside Luna's recovery pen, she was awakened by a sound she had feared she might never hear again, Luna's soft whine requesting attention. The injured wolf's amber eyes were clear and focused for the first time since the shooting, and she managed to lift her head slightly when Margaret reached out to stroke her fur. "There's my brave girl," Margaret whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You're going to be okay. We're all going to be okay." Shadow, Storm, and Ghost responded to Luna's awakening with their own chorus of soft sounds, whines, huffs, and gentle rumbles that seemed to communicate relief, joy, and continued protection. Dr. Williams' examination the following morning confirmed what Margaret had dared to hope. Luna had turned the corner and would make a full recovery, though she would always carry the scar as a reminder of that terrible night. The incident's resolution brought unexpected allies to Margaret's cause. William Crawford, facing the reality of what his trauma had driven him to do, requested permission to work at the sanctuary as part of his court-mandated community service. His military background and genuine remorse created an opportunity for healing that Dr. Morrison suggested could benefit both William and the sanctuary's mission. "Sometimes," Dr. Morrison told Margaret as they watched Luna take her first tentative steps around the barn, "the most powerful testimonials come from those who have experienced the greatest transformation." William's journey from hatred to understanding could help other people overcome their own fears and prejudices. Margaret considered the proposal carefully, watching her 4 wolves interact with their characteristic intelligence and loyalty. They had proven their worth beyond any doubt, demonstrating that love and proper care could indeed bridge the gap between species. But more importantly, they had shown her that healing was possible even after the worst trauma, that families could survive and grow stronger through adversity. As Luna's strength returned over the following weeks, Margaret made her decision. The Emily Chen Memorial Wolf Sanctuary would not just continue, it would expand its mission to include education about trauma, healing, and the power of compassion to overcome even the deepest wounds. William Crawford would indeed work at the sanctuary, but not as punishment for his crimes. He would serve as living proof that transformation was possible, that even the most damaged souls could find redemption through understanding and service to something greater than themselves. The scar on Luna's shoulder would serve as a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing everything, but it would also symbolize survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that connected their unlikely family across species lines. 6 months after that terrible night when gunfire shattered the peace of her mountain sanctuary, Margaret Chen stood before a gathering of 200 people celebrating the official opening of the Emily Chen Memorial Wolf Sanctuary. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, but warmth radiated from the crowd of supporters, researchers, school children, and community members who had come to witness something unprecedented in wildlife conservation. Luna moved gracefully beside Margaret despite the slight limp that remained from her gunshot wound, her white facial markings now complemented by a thin scar across her left shoulder that served as a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. The bullet had damaged muscle and bone, but Dr. Williams' emergency surgery and Luna's remarkable resilience had saved her life. More importantly, Luna's gentle nature had remained unchanged by the trauma, her capacity for trust and affection undiminished by human violence. Shadow, Storm, and Ghost flanked their human family as Margaret approached the podium, their presence no longer a source of controversy, but rather a symbol of hope for a new understanding between humans and wolves. The transformation in community attitudes had been gradual but undeniable, driven largely by William Crawford's complete confession and his subsequent dedication to making amends for the harm he had caused. William stood near the back of the crowd, his military bearing still evident but softened by months of therapy and meaningful work. After his arrest and conviction for breaking and entering, assault, and wildlife harassment, he had been sentenced to 2 years of community service, specifically at Margaret's Sanctuary. What began as court-ordered restitution had evolved into something far more meaningful, a genuine partnership in conservation education and a path toward healing his own psychological wounds. 3 years ago, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, I made a choice that seemed simple at the time. 4 tiny lives were in danger, and I had the power to save them. I never imagined that choice would lead to this moment, or that those 4 wolf cubs would teach me more about courage, loyalty, and love than I had learned in 69 years of human life. Dr. James Morrison stepped forward with the official sanctuary certification, his research into Margaret's human-wolf relationships having contributed to groundbreaking changes in wildlife management policies. The Emily Chen Memorial Wolf Sanctuary represents a new model for wildlife conservation, he announced. Here, we've proven that with proper understanding, training, and respect, humans and wolves can coexist in ways that benefit both species. The sanctuary had been funded through an unprecedented collaboration between private donations, federal wildlife grants, and a substantial contribution from David Chen, who had finally understood that his mother's work represented a legacy worthy of the family name. The facility included educational buildings, research laboratories, proper wolf enclosures for future rescues, and a visitor center that welcomed thousands of school children each year. Margaret's eyes found David in the crowd, his pride evident despite his initial resistance to her unconventional family. He had moved closer to Colorado, establishing a part-time medical practice in nearby Boulder so he could be more involved in both the sanctuary's operations and his mother's life. Watching him interact with the wolves, particularly his special bond with Storm, had healed wounds in their relationship that Margaret hadn't even realized existed.
Tom Bradley stood with a group of local supporters who had never wavered in their belief in Margaret's vision. His weekly mail deliveries had become highlights of community life, with visitors timing their trips to witness the gentle giant postal worker receiving enthusiastic greetings from 4 magnificent wolves who remembered his kindness during their most vulnerable period. Dr. Patricia Williams occupied a place of honor near the front, her veterinary expertise having been crucial not only in saving Luna's life, but in developing the sanctuary's medical protocols. She had documented the wolves' remarkable health and socialization, providing scientific evidence that supported the sanctuary's educational mission and challenged stereotypes about wolf behavior. A group of elementary school students from Pinewood Elementary sat cross-legged on blankets, their eyes wide with fascination as they watched the wolves who had become local celebrities. These children represented a new generation that would grow up understanding wolves not as fairy tale monsters, but as intelligent, social creatures deserving of respect and protection. Many of them had participated in the sanctuary's educational programs, learning about wildlife conservation through direct interaction with Shadow, Storm, Luna, and Ghost. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued her dedication speech. My daughter Emily believed that education could change the world one person at a time. This sanctuary honors her memory by teaching children and adults that fear often comes from ignorance, and that understanding breeds compassion. The wolves you see here today are ambassadors for their species, living proof that coexistence is possible when we approach each other with open hearts and minds. The ceremony included presentations from several conservation organizations that had supported the sanctuary's development. The International Wolf Conservation Society had provided expertise in facility design and educational programming. The Colorado Division of Wildlife, once opposed to Margaret's wolf keeping, now partnered with the sanctuary on research projects and public education initiatives. Universities from across the country had established research partnerships to study the unique behavioral adaptations displayed by Margaret's wolves. William Crawford was invited to speak about his transformation from adversary to advocate, a role he had initially resisted but eventually embraced as part of his healing process. I came to this place consumed by grief and anger, he said, his voice steady but emotional. I saw these wolves as symbols of everything I had lost, monsters that needed to be destroyed. Margaret and her family taught me that hatred only breeds more suffering, while understanding offers the possibility of healing. His testimony had become a powerful component of the sanctuary's educational programs, demonstrating how trauma could be transformed into positive action through compassion and support. William's military background had proven invaluable in developing security protocols and emergency procedures, while his personal story helped visitors understand the complex emotions that often drive human-wildlife conflicts. The sanctuary's research component had already produced significant scientific findings that were influencing wolf conservation efforts worldwide. Dr. Morrison's documentation of the wolves' cognitive abilities, social adaptations, and emotional intelligence had challenged fundamental assumptions about the possibilities for human-animal relationships. The wolves had learned to participate voluntarily in research activities, demonstrating behaviors that suggested they understood their role as ambassadors for their species. Luna's recovery had become a symbol of resilience that inspired everyone who encountered her story. Despite her traumatic injury, she had returned to her role as Margaret's closest companion and the sanctuary's most effective educator. Children who initially feared the wolves often found their courage through Luna's gentle patience, her ability to sense their emotions and respond with appropriate behavior that built trust gradually. Margaret concluded her remarks by acknowledging the broader implications of their work. What we've built here extends far beyond wolf conservation, she said. "We've created a model for approaching difference with curiosity rather than fear, for building bridges across the divides that seem to separate us. Every child who learns to see wolves as individuals rather than monsters, every adult who discovers that their preconceptions might be wrong, represents hope for a more compassionate world." The formal ceremony concluded with the release of rehabilitated wildlife that had been cared for at the sanctuary: owls, hawks, and a young black bear that would return to the wild, carrying with them the sanctuary's message of coexistence. As the crowd dispersed, many visitors lingered to observe the wolves in their natural interactions with Margaret and the sanctuary staff. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Margaret found herself alone with her wolf family for the first time in months. The preparations for the dedication ceremony had consumed weeks of planning and coordination, leaving little time for the quiet moments that had always been the foundation of their relationship. Shadow approached first, as he always did, offering the gentle head bump that served as his greeting for his beloved human alpha. Storm brought her a stick he had found, his eyes bright with playful energy despite the long day. Ghost positioned himself at the perimeter of their gathering, alert but relaxed as he maintained his sentinel duties. And Luna, beautiful Luna with her scarred shoulder and trusting eyes, settled beside Margaret with a contented sigh. "We did it, didn't we?" Margaret murmured, stroking Luna's fur as the other wolves arranged themselves around her in the formation they had maintained for 3 years. "We proved that love is stronger than fear, that understanding can overcome prejudice, that families come in all shapes and sizes." The wolves' response was a chorus of soft sounds, whines, huffs, and gentle rumbles that constituted their unique language of affection and contentment. As the first stars appeared over the Colorado mountains, Margaret felt a peace she had never imagined possible when she first opened her door to 4 dying cubs during a blizzard that had changed everything. The Emily Chen Memorial Wolf Sanctuary would continue their work long after Margaret's time had passed, ensuring that Shadow, Storm, Luna, and Ghost would live out their days surrounded by love and purpose. More importantly, the sanctuary would serve as a living testament to the power of compassion to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what it means to coexist with the natural world. In saving 4 wolf cubs from a blizzard, Margaret had discovered that rescue is always mutual, that in offering love and protection to vulnerable creatures, we often find ourselves saved in return. The wolves had repaid her kindness not just by defending her from immediate danger, but by teaching her that courage, loyalty, and love could indeed change the world, one heart at a time. At 72, Margaret Chen understood what many of us discover in our later years, that the deepest fulfillment often comes not from what we receive, but from what we give. When she opened her door to 4 dying wolf cubs during that Colorado blizzard, she wasn't just saving their lives, she was discovering that purpose and family can arrive in the most unexpected forms. Like so many of us who face empty nests, lost spouses, or retirement's quiet challenges, Margaret had felt adrift until these unlikely companions reminded her that love has no expiration date, and that our capacity to nurture never diminishes with age. Her story proves that the second half of life can be its most meaningful chapter when we stop asking, "What's left for me?" and start asking, "What can I still give?" The wolves didn't just repay her kindness, they showed her that true happiness comes from building connections that transcend our expectations and fears. Margaret's sanctuary became more than a home for rescued wolves. It became a testament that we're never too old to create something beautiful, to change minds, or to prove that love truly conquers fear. Questions for reflection. Have you ever found unexpected purpose or family in your later years?
What unlikely companions have brought meaning to your life when you needed it most? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else to open their heart to new possibilities.